So Variety came out with this article, the top 100 horror films, and after briefly skimming of it, I don't hate it and want to react to it. So obviously not every movie on this list I've seen, unfortunately, like Repulsion. But the first take I have is Suspiria is a masterpiece, and I would rate it much higher, but I will assume there is another Argento film that is going to be coming up on this list. The Human Centipede 2, though, is an interesting choice. You gotta assume they're mostly doing this for shock value. So far, the biggest benefit to this list, though, is making me add a lot of these films to my watch list. The Omen, though, I am fascinated that it is this low. I don't think it's a great film, but I think in terms of iconic horror franchises, this is definitely near the top. And there certainly isn't another Omen film you could throw on here, other than the first Omen that came out this year, which I think is really excellent, but I would be shocked if that tops the original Omen. The Blob is a film I have seen and just really don't understand. Like, I think it's fine, and I can see why people hold this certain reverence towards it. So this placement is fine. I would probably place it lower than the films I have seen already on this list. And Nightmare on Elm Street, I just think needs to be higher. It's Freddy Krueger. I think this movie is really good, so I'm very curious to see which movies are above this one. Creature from the Black Lagoon and a lot of these more universal horror monsters, I think have this certain appeal to them, especially when it comes to the costume designs and the practical effects. So they're charming in that classic horror way. But if you were to watch this today for the first time, I have a feeling you might be disappointed. The Sixth Sense isn't one that initially comes to mind when thinking of horror films, but it certainly does qualify. But I do think this placement is rather fair, being somewhere in the middle. Possession, though, is one that I would say should be top 20. I think as far as movies where a possession takes place, there's definitely one that should be in the top 10. But I think this film is incredible and severely underrated, even though it is one of the most iconic horror films of all time. And unfortunately, The Babadook is one I just never fully understood. I do get why it's on this list, but I think the concept or even the name of The Babadook is almost more popular than the movie itself. Like, I think a lot of people know who The Babadook is, but not all those people have actually watched the movie. So I would put this way lower. Planet Terror, though, is a fun choice, but I don't know if I would put it on this list. And then you got a classic like Candyman. This movie was actually horrifying when I was a kid. There have been several body horror films on this list already, but I do think The Fly should rank near the top. It's just one of the most iconic examples of what you can do within that subgenre. So I'd be curious to see if there is more Cronenberg on this list, but if there isn't, I would not be upset if this is the top one represented from his filmography. Racerhead is a classic choice. In a truly bizarre film, and one that goes beyond what you might think of horror, I would almost put it higher than the middle here. I was curious to see if we would get some of this more modern horror, and I think The Witch is a good choice. And I don't think Egger's other film, The Lighthouse, will be on this list, even though I would probably put it on this list over The Witch. The Birds, classic. Almost shocked that it is this low, and I don't even love the film. It's one of my least favorite Hitchcocks, but it is iconic in a way that people understand what it is without even having seen the film. And Godzilla is another example that, in a way, stretches the definition of horror, even though I do think it really fits, especially when you were thinking of the time period when this was released. It was in many ways unlike anything that's ever been done. So knowing that it is qualified for this list, I think it needs to be higher up, as does The Thing. I mean, The Thing, that is a top 10 horror film. Although we will definitely see other Carpenter coming up. Invisible Man's another one that, it's fine. I feel like I'm a bad cinephile for preferring the 2020 version. And Deep Red was the one that I figured would be on here. And so if we are comparing this with Suspiria, I do think Suspiria is significantly better, but I completely understand the love that people have for this film. And Ari Aster has entered the list. I have loved all three of his feature films, and I do think Hereditary might be my least favorite of the three, which is just splitting hairs at that point. So I do hope to see my favorite of his come up soon. Evil Dead 2, another one that I think needs to be in the top 20 at least, but I think it's the best of the trilogy, so I'd be surprised if we saw another one appear. M is such a good film. 5 out of 5, no notes. Like, this has got to be in the top 10. It's one of those experiences where it is so unique even when comparing it to other movies today. This is one of those films that gets such a strong recommendation from me. I feel like I keep saying all these films need to be higher up, but it's getting to the point where I can't really complain because Scream is within the top 25. But what this film did to the genre, and not even with horror, but movies as a whole, igniting this layer of meta commentary that movies can have about themselves, it certainly gets overplayed now within film, but at the time, this was revolutionary. And this entire franchise, but this movie specifically, I think is one of the most important things that's ever happened to the genre. And then there's the Blair Witch Project, which ignited a whole new trend that we have never seen before, certainly earning its spot within the top 25, as well as Dawn of the Dead. I feel like they're all just going to be big hitters at this point. And yeah, Get Out. I personally would put this in my top 10, but only because I think it is one of the best versions of this modern horror that extends to a larger cultural conversation that certainly horror movies have always had within them. But the fact that it is so modern and touching such a specific point in our culture, as well as blending genres, I think it's truly special. And I know I'm just celebrating that films are in the top 25, but this one needs to be way higher. I can't say it's the best Stephen King adaptation because it's certainly different, but what can I say? I love it. I am stunned that this is as low as it is. And probably the last Carpenter we'll see on this list, but this is one of the original slasher films, which I'm curious to see if we get the other two I'll have in mind. And Don't Look Now, a great addition that not enough people have seen, and I wouldn't describe it as scary, but horrific, if that makes sense, as this film will stick with you in a very haunting way. Nosferatu, I think, is the best version of Dracula we've seen. And Silence of the Lambs cannot argue with the greatness of this film. King Kong being this high. I think it's correct to place this above Godzilla, but I don't know. This really pushes the boundaries, in my mind, of what I would consider to be a horror film. And Alien is just another one of those 5 out of 5 masterpieces. I'm just happy it's being appreciated. Carrie is my favorite Brian De Palma. Another one where it really uses the social elements, in this case being a teenage girl, and uses that to its benefit within the horror genre. I'm a little surprised to see Night of the Living Dead this much higher than its sequel, but I know most people consider both of them to be pretty equal, so no major complaints there. Rosemary's Baby absolutely needs to be within this conversation. Although, anytime you talk about Polanski, it gets complicated, but there's no denying he did create a near perfect work of art here. Jaws also deserves to be within this conversation. And I actually think it's due to this movie mostly existing in daylight why people don't always consider it horror, but the fact alone that it ignited what we now know as the summer blockbuster gives it more than enough reason to be within the top 5. Psycho. This would be my number 1 horror movie, and I do understand the complaints, the problematic view of transgenders, and even the clunky exposition that wraps this film up. But what Hitchcock was able to do in subverting our expectations, even killing off the lead character within the first half of this film, I think it's a true masterpiece and one of the greatest films that was ever created. The Exorcist is a worthy choice within the top 5. And yes, this is the other possession film I was talking about, but what makes this so special is how it stands the test of time with its iconic imagery and scenes. And I'm pretty sure, if I'm not incorrect, this was one of the few times that there was an acting nomination at the Academy Awards for a horror film. So many people list this as the scariest film they have ever seen, and if you watch it, it's very easy to see why they think that. And then there's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This film is interesting because if you were like me and grew up in the 2000s, when they were remaking all the classic horror films, you might have seen the 2003 version before this one, like I did. And those films were certainly less than ideal, especially compared to the original, as they were more schlocky. I just don't think horror was taken as seriously within that era. And so watching this film for the first time, after being exposed to the character of Leatherface, it's incredible to see how grounded it actually was, and I do think it is a worthy number 1 horror film to be on this list. I think there are probably about 3 films I think should have deserved a spot on this list. The 1977 film House is one of the most creative films I have ever seen in my life. Also, Black Christmas, which predates Halloween as being one of the first slasher films ever, and when you watch that film, you can see where John Carpenter got all his inspiration. And the Ari Aster I would put above Hereditary would be Midsommar, but that's just personal preference, and honestly, I am quite pleased with how this list went. So let me know down in the comments what is your favorite horror film and what deserved a spot on this list.